George Kennan, back in the 1950s, 1952, the height of the Cold War. This is a man, George Kennan, who started in the State Department in 1928, who was there throughout the Cold War, and then just kept repeatedly saying, you know what? We're not operating in a way that is going to be conducive to peace in this region in the future. He was warning. As soon as the wall came down, as soon as Dick Cheney came out with a plan on how we were going to deal with Russia, well, what do we need to deal with exactly? Weren't they our friend at that point? Well, I mean, having friends, I guess, is not necessarily good for the military complex business, now is it? I want to point out that if you do a search right now on Google, go ahead, go do it. If you do a search and you type in, did we promise Russia that we wouldn't expand NATO? What you immediately get is that is disinformation. There was no promise to not to enlarge NATO. You see at Harvard Law School, that's the first thing that comes up. Harvard, oh, lovely place that is. I won't even go there. Don't even get me started. The whole Claudine thing, Claudine gave it. There was no promise not to enlarge NATO. That's what Harvard says. France 24, their article is actually a little more fair than what you see in the immediate headlines, because the immediate headline is effectively that, you know, this isn't true. And then you get debunking Russian disinformation on NATO. And that's provided courtesy of NATO itself. So NATO's like, no, well, we always had a shot at expanding our reach. Not really, guys. And I have proof of it because I've gone back to primary sources. But before I show you that, I want you to hear from Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin himself, who told Tucker Carlson in a very lengthy interview, it was over 2 hours long. Tucker got to hear the whole 800-year history of Russia. By the way, history is really important to Putin and to many in Russia. He got to hear why it is that Vladimir Putin is so upset about NATO coming closer and closer. Take a listen.
That is exactly what the miscalculation is. CIA did its job to complete the coup. I think one of the deputy secretaries of state said that it cost a large sum of money, almost 5 billion. But the political mistake was colossal. Why would they have to do that? All this could have been done legally, without victims, without military action, without losing Crimea. We would have never considered to even lift a finger if it hadn't been for the bloody developments on Maidan. Because we agreed with the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our borders should be along the borders of former Union's republics. We agreed to that. But we never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us. For decades, we kept asking, don't do this, don't do that. And what triggered the latest events? Firstly, the current Ukrainian leadership declared that it would not implement the Minsk agreements, which had been signed, as you know, after the events of 2014 in Minsk, where the plan of peaceful settlement in Donbass was set forth. But no, the current Ukrainian leadership, foreign minister, all other officials, and then president himself said that they don't like anything about the Minsk agreements. In other words, they were not going to implement it. A year or a year and a half ago, former leaders of Germany and France said openly to the whole world that they indeed signed the Minsk agreements, but they never intended to implement them. They simply led us by the nose.
Wow. Okay, so he's kind of angry because he says, hang on, we had a deal. That was part of the whole Cold War thing going down. We had a deal. And then on top of the deal, you know, we had the Minsk agreements and you guys didn't abide by them. Apparently you never had any intention of abiding by them. And therein lies some of the problem. Well, here's the thing. he may be onto something. Dare I say, oh my gosh, I said it. CNN's going to be all over me, right? Did you see CNN? Totally. We're going to get to that in a second. They jumped all over Tucker, poor Tucker, because he dared to sit down with Vladimir Putin. But here's the thing. Putin's actually right. Putin is making the point that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had a handshake deal that we were going to be friends and they were not going to expand NATO. But what did we do? We expanded NATO. I mean, back then it was 17 countries, and today it's 30, ladies and gentlemen. So how did that go down? Apparently, because of a plan Dick Cheney put in place and released, or it got leaked to, the New York Times back in 1992. Now, just to refresh your memory, the wall goes down in November 1989. Reagan is president. Gorbachev, take down this wall. There you go. Bush comes in, succeeding Reagan. Cheney's not VP at this point. No. He's just the lowly defense secretary who's got this plan to get the whole military complex back up and running effectively. So in 1992, this thing gets released. Let me share with you part of that plan. Dick Cheney winds up having the thing published in the New York Times. And it reads, quote, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia." So he's saying, look, we're done with the USSR as our rival. Cold War's over. The wall's down. What do we do now? Oh, it must be something else we can do right now, right? And so he comes up with this 1992 plan for containing Russia. Let me just tell you, even the people in the administration at the time thought it was nuts. Let me go back to an article. This one is actually from the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, of which I was a member. Let's go to the CFR piece, Drew. Do we have that one handy for folks? You see this one. It's called "The Fall of the Wall: An American Grand Strategy." So they cite this. This is a guy who's coming out years later in 2009, November 2009. But he's citing Cheney's notorious, he calls it notorious, 1992 defense planning guidance. That's what it was, the defense planning guidance, which got leaked to the New York Times. And he says what made the document controversial was that it argued that the United States needed to prevent not only its adversaries from gaining greater power in the core regions, but also major allies such as Germany and Japan. The White House disavowed the Cheney document, and George H.W. Bush's national security advisor later described the Pentagon's approach, in other words, Cheney's approach, at the time as, quote, nutty. Okay, so it was nutty back then, but now it's nutty of us to think that, oh, maybe there was ever anything in place that would have prevented NATO from getting bigger and bigger and bigger. No, it was Cheney's idea to make NATO bigger and bigger and bigger, and simultaneously at the same time make sure that, and I get this, you don't want Germany turning into a superpower or Japan turning into a superpower that could rival or threaten you, the United States of America. The question though is, why is all the energy being focused on Russia? Maybe by keeping them down on the farm, right? You keep all these countries down and they all scramble to be part of NATO, and it's exciting to be part of NATO, and you're going to be protected by the United States if you're in NATO. If you keep them all sort of part of NATO and under your thumb, you need to have an enemy to do that. And it just so happens that Russia, given our Cold War relationship that we had for years and years, is still kind of a nifty little enemy to have. We knew how to play that game, did we not? We'd been playing it for years and years. And then you get ambassadors out there that are actually real ambassadors and real think tanky type people like George Kennan that actually were doing this for the right reasons. And George Kennan's like, hey, like, wait a second. Like, this is not going to be good. This is a recipe for disaster.